I want a divorce, Camille.
You're divorcing me for someone you just met? What happened to all the years I've been there for you? They don't matter anymore? All the years we've struggled together?
Camille, I don't love you anymore. I found someone I love.
I gave you my all in this marriage and now you feel I'm not needed anymore?
I'm sorry, Camille.
Please don't leave me like this.
I have given Camille the divorce papers. We will be together very soon. I'm happy we're finally doing this. Can't wait for us to get married and move in together.
Me too. I wish I met you sooner.
We need to stack these tighter to fit everything. We can now leave happily and free from Camille.
I really like our new home. It is perfect for us. Hurry up, please put all the furniture in the van immediately. I have a flight to catch.
There's nothing left. She took everything.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system. Please leave your message after the tone.
When are we getting married?
In a month's time.
I love you so much.
I love you too. All my savings are all gone. Oh my God, what have I done to myself? She ran away with everything I have. She made me divorce my wife, took everything I have and ran away. I took her in. By the time I got back from work, she had emptied my savings account and had sold every single property I owned.
She thought she'd already lived through the worst betrayal of her life. She was wrong, because the woman who broke up her marriage was about to get a taste of her own medicine. And what happened next would leave an entire family and an entire internet speechless. By the end of this story, the husband who cheated will lose almost everything. The woman he cheated with will disappear with his money, and another man, and the wife who was the loser in all of this, she'll have the last laugh. Stay with me. This one gets wild. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to follow or hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Camille had built her entire adult life around the idea that loyalty was something you earned through years of quietly showing up. She had shown up for Andre through the slow, broke seasons of his trucking business, through his father's funeral, through every late night he came home smelling like someone else's perfume and swore on his mother's name that it was just cologne from a client's office building. She wanted to believe him because the alternative meant admitting she had ignored every quiet warning her own body had been giving her for almost a year. Her sister had noticed it first, the way Andre's phone stayed face down on every surface, the way he started stepping into the garage and shutting the door to take calls that used to happen right at the dinner table. Camille told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself a lot of things that year, mostly because the truth felt too heavy to carry, while still showing up for work, for her mother's church group, for the version of her life she had spent a decade building. Camille worked as a billing coordinator at a regional hospital outside Charlotte, a job she had held for 9 years, steady and unglamorous in the way that builds a person's quiet confidence over time. She liked the predictability of it, the way numbers either balanced or they didn't, the way a problem in her work always had a traceable answer if you were patient enough to look for it. That same patience would later become the most important tool she owned, though she didn't know it yet. At home, she managed the household finances the old-fashioned way. A shared spreadsheet, a joint savings account, automatic transfers on the 1st and the 15th. She had grown up watching her own mother get blindsided by her father's hidden debts, and she had promised herself as a teenager that she would never let financial secrecy creep into a marriage of her own. It was an irony she wouldn't fully appreciate until much later, that the secrecy she feared most ended up arriving wearing an entirely different face. Simone entered the picture the way most affairs do, slowly enough that no one could point to the exact moment it became something dangerous. She worked dispatch for one of the trucking outfits Andre's logistics company contracted with regularly, and their early conversations were nothing more than scheduling calls, mileage confirmations, small talk about delayed shipments stuck somewhere on I-85. But Simone had a particular skill that made her memorable to nearly every man who crossed her path for more than a few weeks. She listened in a way that made people feel like the most important person in the room, and she remembered small details most people would forget within a day: the name of Andre's childhood dog, the diner off Route 9 where he used to eat breakfast with his father, the exact way he liked his coffee on cold mornings before a long route. Andre mistook that attentiveness for a rare kind of connection. What he didn't understand yet was that Simone treated nearly every relationship in her life like a long game. Several moves planned in advance, and he was already several steps behind her before he ever realized they were playing. The first real crack appeared on a Thursday in early spring, when Camille noticed a hotel charge on a card she rarely checked because she trusted Andre completely with their shared finances. It wasn't a large amount, just under $200, but it was registered to a town 60 miles outside any delivery route Andre was supposed to be running that week. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she did something that would define the rest of this story. She started paying quiet, careful attention. She began cross-referencing his mileage logs against the company's GPS tracking software, which she had access to through her own administrative login. She started noting dates, times, locations, building a private record the way she might build a billing dispute at work, piece by piece, with documentation strong enough to hold up under scrutiny. By the time she had gathered 3 months of contradictions, the picture in front of her was impossible to misread. Andre, for his part, had convinced himself that what he was doing with Simone existed in some separate compartment of his life, untouched by the rest of it. He told himself the marriage had already gone stale, that Camille had become more like a business partner than a wife, that he deserved to feel the kind of attention Simone gave him so easily. It is a familiar story, one almost every person who has ever been betrayed has heard in some form: the cheating partner rewriting the history of the relationship in real time to justify what they already know is wrong. Andre never once stopped to ask himself why Simone, a woman nearly a decade younger with no obligations tying her to him, was so eager to insert herself into the daily details of his business and his finances within months of their relationship beginning. He was flattered. He did not yet understand that flattery, in the wrong hands, is simply a tool. When Camille finally confronted him, she did not raise her voice. She laid the documents out across the kitchen table like a closing argument. Mileage logs beside hotel statements, beside a printed map with 3 months of inconsistent locations circled in red ink. Andre sat across from her in a silence that stretched almost a full minute, and that silence told her everything the documents already had. He admitted it eventually, quietly, almost relieved to stop pretending. He did not apologize the way she expected him to. He simply said he never meant for it to go this far, the kind of sentence that explains nothing, and excuses even less. Camille asked him to choose, right there at the table, between the life they had built and whatever this other thing had become. He didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, longer than it should have been, the marriage ended in every way that actually mattered, long before either of them filed a single piece of paperwork. Andre moved out 3 weeks later, and within a month he had moved in with Simone, fully convinced he had finally found a woman who understood him in ways Camille apparently never had. He told friends it felt like a weight had lifted, like he could finally breathe in his own home. What he failed to notice, distracted by the early excitement of new beginnings, was how quickly Simone began inserting herself into the financial architecture of his life. She offered, gently and seemingly out of genuine concern, to help manage his business accounts during what she called his stressful transition period. Andre, grateful for anyone willing to lighten the load of rebuilding a life mid-divorce, agreed without much hesitation. Within 90 days, her name had been added as a secondary user to his primary business checking account. Within 5 months, she had co-signed a vehicle loan that, through paperwork Andre barely skimmed before signing, ended up registered solely under her name once the loan cleared underwriting. While Andre believed he was rebuilding a better version of his life, Camille was quietly constructing something entirely different in her own corner of the world. She kept the house with the wraparound porch, the one she had dreamed about since she was a little girl flipping through home magazines at her grandmother's kitchen table. She kept her job at the hospital, steady as ever, and she kept every piece of financial documentation from their marriage, not out of bitterness or some plan for revenge, but out of a hard-earned instinct that information was the only real protection a woman in her position had left. She rarely brought Andre's name up in conversation, and when it did come up among mutual friends, she simply said she hoped he found whatever it was he was looking for. People around her sometimes mistook that calm for weakness, assuming she had simply moved on too easily or hadn't fully processed what had happened. In reality, Camille had survived the worst version of betrayal once already, and she had no intention of being caught off guard again by anything life decided to throw at her next. 8 months into Andre and Simone's relationship, something subtle but unmistakable began shifting in the rhythm of their shared household. Simone started taking phone calls behind a locked bathroom door, something she had never done in the earlier months of living together. She mentioned, almost too casually, reconnecting with an old friend from her hometown back in Savannah, a man she described simply as someone she used to know growing up, named Quincy. She described the reunion with such ease that Andre never thought to ask a single follow-up question, never noticed the way her voice softened slightly differently when she said his name, compared to how she talked about anyone else. What Andre did not know, and would not learn for many more months, was that Quincy was not an old friend reappearing out of nowhere by coincidence. Quincy was Simone's former partner of nearly 6 years, a relationship that had never fully ended, even after he relocated 3 states away for a warehouse management position. Phone records obtained much later in this story would show the two had remained in near constant contact the entire time Simone was living under Andre's roof, calling and texting almost daily, long before Andre ever heard the name Quincy spoken aloud at his own dinner table. Over the months that followed, Simone became far more strategic than she ever was affectionate, though the shift happened so gradually that Andre barely registered it as a change at all. She suggested they consolidate his personal savings into a joint account for, in her words, easier bill management and better visibility into their shared expenses. She encouraged him to expand his trucking business by taking out a new line of business credit, conveniently listing herself as an authorized user on the account from the very beginning. Andre, distracted by the demands of growing his fleet and still emotionally raw from the divorce, signed whatever paperwork she placed in front of him without reading closely enough to notice the fine print that mattered most. In total, more than $40,000 moved out of accounts connected to his business over a span of roughly 10 months, funneled into purchases he never personally approved, and into an apartment he did not even know existed. One Simone had quietly leased under a name, close enough to her own legal name, that it would never raise suspicion on a casual glance at a bank statement. The unraveling, when it finally came, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable day that gives no warning of what it's about to deliver. Andre returned home early from a delivery run after a client cancellation freed up his afternoon unexpectedly. The apartment was stripped down to bare walls. No furniture remained in the living room. The closet held nothing but a few wire hangers swinging gently from the draft of the front door he'd left open in shock. There was no trace of Simone anywhere except a single folded note left on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a coffee mug she had apparently decided not to take with her. The note was short, only a handful of sentences, telling him she had found where she truly belonged and wishing him well, with everything moving forward, as though she were leaving a job rather than a relationship she had spent nearly a year inside of. Andre called her phone more than a dozen times that afternoon with no answer. When he checked the joint account later that evening, it was nearly empty, drained down to less than $200. When he called the dealership about the vehicle loan the following morning, he learned the loan had already been paid off in full and the title transferred entirely into her name 2 weeks earlier. Paperwork he had apparently signed without fully understanding what it authorized. Quincy, on the other side of this unfolding story, had no idea that Simone's sudden financial stability, when she arrived at his doorstep, came at another man's expense. He believed, because she told him so convincingly, that she had simply saved diligently while working her dispatch job over the previous several years. He welcomed her into his home in Savannah without hesitation, impressed by how quickly and comfortably she seemed to adapt to their new life together, how effortlessly she furnished an entire apartment within weeks of arriving. It wasn't until nearly 2 months later, when a credit card statement revealed a $6,000 charge he never personally authorized, that Quincy began asking the kinds of pointed questions Andre wished, in hindsight, he had asked much earlier in his own relationship with Simone. Slowly, piece by piece, going through statements he hadn't bothered reviewing closely before, Quincy started uncovering a pattern that felt unsettlingly familiar. Financial entanglement disguised carefully as partnership. Charm deployed not as genuine affection, but as a calculated tool, and a woman who had very clearly run this exact sequence of events on someone before him. Desperate, humiliated, and running out of options to recover what he could, Andre eventually reached out to the one person who still had organized, dated records of their shared financial history from the marriage, Camille. He fully expected resistance when he called her, maybe even a small amount of satisfaction on her end given everything he had put her through over the previous 2 years. Instead, Camille listened to his entire situation over the phone without once interrupting him, let him finish explaining what had happened without offering judgment in either direction. She then calmly retrieved an old folder she had kept in a filing cabinet in her home office, containing years of bank statements and transaction histories from their marriage. The very same documentation she had quietly preserved long after their divorce had been finalized in court. She handed the folder to him in person, not out of any remaining loyalty to their shared past, but because she understood firsthand, more intimately than almost anyone else could, exactly how disorienting it feels to discover that someone you trusted completely had been managing your finances against your own interests the entire time you believed otherwise. In the months that followed this final exchange between them, Simone relocated once again, this time leaving the state of Georgia entirely, leaving Quincy behind in much the same way she had once left Andre, with drained accounts and a long list of unanswered questions trailing behind her. Andre slowly began rebuilding his trucking business, using the limited records he managed to recover with the help of an attorney, carrying with him a hard lesson about financial boundaries he hadn't fully understood the value of until it had already cost him nearly everything he'd spent a decade building. Camille, meanwhile, sold the house with the wraparound porch roughly 18 months after their divorce was finalized, not out of sorrow or lingering attachment to the past, but because she had quietly started an entirely new chapter of her own life by that point and no longer needed a house full of old memories anchoring her in place. She moved across town into a smaller, brighter home near her sister, started a small financial consulting practice on the side of her hospital job, using exactly the kind of meticulous documentation skills that had once protected her. and rarely spoke about Andre or Simone again, except occasionally, to say that some lessons only become clear once you're far enough removed to see them without the noise of emotion clouding the picture. What this story ultimately leaves behind isn't a simple lesson about cheating or about karma catching up with people who do wrong, though it might look that way on the surface. It's a quieter, more uncomfortable truth about how betrayal has a tendency to circle back toward the very person who set it in motion, sometimes in slower and stranger ways than anyone watching from the outside could have predicted. Andre lost his marriage chasing something that, by every account, was never built to last beyond its own usefulness. Simone lost the trust of two different men, using nearly identical methods on each of them, until the pattern itself finally caught up with her reputation in a town small enough for word to travel. And Camille, the woman almost everyone around her assumed had lost the most when this story began, ended up being the only person in the entire sequence of events who walked away with her life fully intact, her name protected, her finances secure, and her future entirely her own, to decide without anyone else's hand on the wheel. Sometimes the person who appears at the very beginning of a story like this, to have lost everything, turns out to be the only one still standing once the dust has fully settled and everyone else has to live with what they chose along the way. What most people who heard pieces of this story secondhand never realized was just how long Simone's pattern had actually been running before Andre ever entered the picture. Years before she met him, Simone had been engaged briefly to a contractor in Augusta, a relationship that ended abruptly after he discovered nearly $11,000 had been moved out of a renovation account meant for his business. He never pursued legal action, partly out of embarrassment, and partly because he simply wanted to move on with his life as quickly as possible. Before that, there had been a longer relationship during her early 20s with a man who owned a small chain of car washes around Columbia, South Carolina, a relationship that ended the same way, with him discovering missing funds only after she had already relocated. None of these men ever crossed paths with each other, and none of them ever spoke publicly about what had happened, which is exactly how Simone had managed to repeat the same pattern for nearly a decade without consequence. It would take Andre's situation, and the slow unraveling that followed it, to finally connect threads that had stayed separate for years. Camille's attorney, a methodical woman named Renata, who had handled the original divorce, was the first person to suggest that what had happened to Andre might not be an isolated incident at all. When Andre reached out to Camille for the second time, this time asking if she knew anyone who could help him understand his legal options, Camille connected him with Renata almost reluctantly, uncertain whether helping him further crossed a line she didn't want to cross. Renata agreed to a single consultation, mostly as a courtesy to Camille, and what she found during that first review of Andre's financial documents immediately raised concerns that went beyond a simple breakup gone wrong. The pattern of account access, the timing of the vehicle transfer, the apartment lease under a near-identical name, all of it suggested intent rather than carelessness. Renata recommended Andre file a police report for financial exploitation rather than simply treating it as a private matter between former partners, a suggestion Andre initially resisted out of pride before eventually following through. The detective assigned to Andre's case, a soft-spoken man named Desmond, who had spent over a decade investigating financial crimes in the county, approached the situation with more patience than Andre expected. Desmond explained early on that cases like this were notoriously difficult to prosecute, since most of the money had moved through accounts Simone had legal access to, even if that access had been granted under misleading circumstances. Andre had technically signed every document himself, technically authorized every transfer, technically agreed to add her name to accounts she would later strip clean. The law, Desmond explained gently, often struggles to distinguish between manipulation and poor judgment, even when the difference feels obvious to the person who lived through it. Still, Desmond agreed to open an inquiry, partly because the pattern Andre described matched something vaguely familiar from an old case file involving a different victim entirely, one that had never been fully closed. That old case file belonged to the contractor from Augusta, the same man Simone had been briefly engaged to years earlier. He had never filed an official report at the time, embarrassed by what had happened, and reluctant to involve police in what felt like a personal failure rather than a crime. But during an unrelated conversation with a colleague years later, he had mentioned the situation in passing, and that colleague happened to know Desmond from a community policing event. It was a thin connection, the kind investigators rarely get to rely on, but it was enough for Desmond to reach out to the contractor directly and ask if he would be willing to share what he remembered. The contractor agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and his account lined up almost exactly with Andre's, down to the pattern of joint accounts established within months and large transfers occurring shortly before a sudden disappearance. Meanwhile, in Savannah, Quincy had begun his own quiet investigation after the credit card discrepancy first caught his attention. Unlike Andre, Quincy had a background in logistics auditing through his warehouse management work, and he approached the situation the way he approached discrepancies in inventory counts, methodically and without emotional interference clouding his process. He pulled 3 months of statements across every account Simone had access to, and built a simple spreadsheet tracking dates, amounts, and merchant locations. What he found troubled him deeply. Several charges had been made at furniture stores and electronics retailers during weeks when Simone had told him she was visiting her sister in Atlanta, a sister Quincy later learned did not actually live in Atlanta at all, and according to public records, did not appear to exist under the name Simone had given him. Quincy confronted Simone about the discrepancies on a Sunday evening, calmly and without raising his voice, laying his spreadsheet on the table between them, much the way Camille once had with Andre. Simone's response, according to what Quincy later shared with Andre after the two men eventually connected through Desmond's investigation, was to minimize everything at first, claiming the charges were gifts for him that she wanted to keep as a surprise. When Quincy pressed further, asking specifically about the fictional sister and the unexplained $6,000 charge, Simone shifted tactics entirely, accusing him of not trusting her, of treating her like a suspect in her own home. It was the same deflection technique she had used on Andre months earlier, treating any reasonable question as an attack rather than addressing the substance of what was being asked. The conversation between Andre and Quincy, when it finally happened roughly 4 months after Andre's own discovery, was arranged through Desmond as part of the broader investigation. Both men were initially wary of each other, each carrying a complicated mixture of embarrassment and anger that made the early minutes of their conversation tense. But as they compared timelines, financial patterns, and even small personal details Simone had shared with each of them, the similarities became impossible to ignore. She had told both men the exact same story about a difficult childhood involving a parent's illness, a story that turned out, upon closer inspection by Desmond's team, to be almost entirely fabricated. She had used nearly identical language in describing her feelings for each of them during the early months of their relationships, phrases specific enough that it felt less like genuine sentiment and more like a script she had simply reused. Camille, watching this unfold from a careful distance, found herself unexpectedly moved by how thoroughly the investigation validated everything she had quietly suspected, but never had the resources to prove during her own marriage. She had always wondered, in the back of her mind, whether Andre's affair had been a unique failure of their specific relationship, or something closer to a pattern she simply hadn't been equipped to see coming. Learning the full scope of what Simone had done, not just to Andre but to at least 3 other men across nearly a decade, gave Camille a strange kind of closure she hadn't expected to need. It wasn't vindication exactly, since nothing about the situation felt like a victory. It was something closer to confirmation, The simple relief of finally understanding that she had not failed to see something obvious, but had instead encountered someone who had built an entire pattern of behavior specifically designed to be difficult to see until it was too late. The legal process that followed moved slower than anyone involved would have liked, because so much of what Simone had done existed in a gray area between manipulation and technically authorized access. Prosecutors were initially hesitant to pursue criminal charges, worried that a jury might view the case as nothing more than a series of bad relationships rather than a pattern of financial exploitation. Renata, working alongside Desmond, helped build a civil case instead, focused on recovering damages through the financial paper trail rather than pursuing criminal liability that might never hold up in court. It took nearly a year of depositions, financial audits, and testimony from the contractor in Augusta, from Quincy, and eventually from a fourth man who came forward after seeing a brief local news segment about the case, before a judge finally ruled in favor of partial financial recovery for both Andre and Quincy. Simone did not appear in court for the final ruling. By that point, she had already relocated again, this time reportedly somewhere in the Midwest, far enough from Georgia and the Carolinas that serving her with court documents became its own prolonged process, requiring a private investigator hired jointly by Andre and Quincy's attorneys. When she was finally located and the judgment was served, the recovery amount was modest compared to what had actually been taken. A fraction of the original losses split between two men who had each lost tens of thousands of dollars to the same woman within the same 2-year period. Andre received just under $9,000 after legal fees. Quincy received slightly less. Neither amount came close to undoing the financial damage either man had experienced, but both men later said the ruling mattered less for the money itself and more for the simple fact that a court had formally acknowledged what had happened to them was real, documented, and not simply their own failure to manage a relationship properly. Andre's business never fully returned to where it had been before the affair began, though it stabilized enough over the following 2 years to keep him employed and independent, rather than folding entirely. He moved into a smaller apartment outside the city, scaled his fleet down to 2 trucks instead of the 5 he had once managed, and slowly rebuilt a client base that had grown skeptical of him during the period when missed payments and account issues had made him appear unreliable to several long-time contracts. He spoke rarely about the relationship afterward, except once during a community finance workshop Camille helped organize through her consulting practice, where he agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to share his experience anonymously as a cautionary example of how quickly financial control can be handed over inside a new relationship without anyone noticing until it's far too late to undo. Quincy, for his part, sold the house in Savannah roughly a year after the ruling, partly because the financial strain of legal fees had made the mortgage difficult to sustain alone, and partly because he no longer wanted to live somewhere so closely associated with that period of his life. He relocated to be closer to his brother in Charlotte, oddly enough landing in the same general area where Camille had rebuilt her own life years earlier, though the two never crossed paths directly. He started working in a different industry entirely, moving away from logistics auditing toward a role in nonprofit financial oversight, work he later described as more meaningful, precisely because it involved helping people protect their finances rather than simply tracking inventory numbers for a private company. Camille's consulting practice grew steadily over those same years, eventually becoming successful enough that she left her hospital billing position entirely to focus on it full-time. Much of her client base came through word of mouth among women in similar situations. Women navigating divorce, financial recovery after exploitative relationships, or simply trying to build the kind of documentation habits that had protected Camille so effectively during her own crisis. She never advertised her own story directly, But enough people in her circle knew the broad outline of what had happened, that her practice became known, somewhat informally, as a place where women could get practical financial guidance from someone who genuinely understood what it felt like to rebuild a life from documentation and quiet persistence rather than dramatic confrontation. 5 years after the night Simone disappeared from the apartment she shared with Andre, leaving nothing behind but a folded note and an empty coffee mug, the 4 men she had taken money from, the contractor, the car wash owner, Andre, and Quincy, had never all spoken to each other directly. Desmond, the detective who had connected most of their stories together, eventually retired from the force, but he kept a private note in his own records describing the case as one of the more unusual financial exploitation patterns he had encountered in his career, not because of the amounts involved, which were relatively modest compared to larger fraud cases he had worked, but because of how long the pattern had gone unnoticed, simply because each man involved had been too embarrassed or too disconnected from the others to ever compare notes until circumstances forced their stories together. As for Simone herself, what happened to her afterward remains something of an open question, even now. Court records show she eventually settled the judgment against her through a structured payment plan that took nearly 4 years to complete in full. Beyond that, very little public information exists about where she ultimately landed, or whether the pattern continued elsewhere with someone new who has yet to come forward. It is, in its own unsettling way, the part of this story that resists a clean resolution. A reminder that not every story ends with the person responsible facing a consequence large enough to match what they took from the people who trusted them. What can be said with certainty is that 4 men, separated by years and states and circumstances, eventually found enough overlapping pieces of the same story to understand they had not simply made a personal mistake in choosing the wrong partner, but had instead encountered someone operating a pattern refined carefully enough to avoid detection for the better part of a decade. Camille, when asked once during that same community workshop what she would say to someone currently living through the early stages of a betrayal like the one she experienced, didn't offer the kind of simple advice people often expect in these situations. She didn't tell people to leave immediately, or to confront a partner the moment suspicion arises, or to never trust again after being hurt. Instead, she said the most useful thing she had learned was the value of paying attention without panic, of building a clear record of what was actually happening, rather than relying solely on feelings that can be manipulated by someone skilled enough to manage them. She said betrayal when it happens often feels disorienting, specifically because it's designed to be confusing, layered carefully enough that the person experiencing it starts doubting their own perception of events. Documentation, she said, however unglamorous it sounds, had been the single tool that allowed her to separate what she actually knew from what she had simply been told to believe. In the end, this is a story without a single clear villain receiving a single clear punishment, without a courtroom scene ending in dramatic justice, without the kind of tidy resolution most people hope for when a story like this begins. It is instead a story about how patterns repeat themselves quietly across years and across people who never meet each other until circumstances force their separate experiences into the same frame. It is a story about a woman who lost what she thought was everything at the very beginning, only to be the one person who ended up building something stable and entirely her own once the dust settled. And it is a reminder, perhaps the most important one this story has to offer, that the people who hurt us rarely operate as carefully or as cleverly as they appear in the moment, and that patience, documentation, and time have a way of revealing exactly what someone tried so hard to keep hidden. The 4th man who eventually came forward, the one Desmond's team had only been able to identify after a brief local news segment aired, describing the broader pattern without naming Simone directly, turned out to have one of the longer and more complicated histories with her. His name was Otis, a quiet, soft-spoken man who managed a small fleet of delivery vans for a regional grocery distributor outside Macon. Otis had dated Simone for nearly a year, several years before she ever met Andre. During a period in her life, she rarely mentioned to anyone who came after him. Unlike the others, Otis had actually married Simone briefly, a marriage that lasted just under 14 months before ending in a quiet, uncontested divorce that he never discussed with friends or family afterward. He had assumed, for years, that the financial losses he experienced during that marriage were simply the result of his own poor budgeting during a difficult stretch of his life. And it wasn't until he saw the news segment, vague as it was, that he began to suspect something else entirely had been happening underneath the surface of what he remembered as an ordinary, if difficult, young marriage. When Desmond reached out to Otis directly, the conversation was longer and more emotional than any of the previous interviews had been. Otis explained that during their short marriage, Simone had convinced him to refinance his truck loan under terms that benefited her more than him, had taken out a small personal loan in his name that he hadn't fully understood the implications of at the time, and had disappeared for nearly 3 weeks early in their marriage, with no explanation beyond a vague mention of visiting family. A pattern that, in hindsight, matched almost exactly what Quincy and Andre had each separately described. Otis had never connected these dots himself, partly because the marriage had ended so long before Simone's relationships with Andre and Quincy began, and partly because he had simply absorbed the financial losses as his own failure rather than recognizing them as part of something larger and more deliberate. Otis's willingness to testify, even briefly, gave the civil case a depth it hadn't previously had, establishing a documented pattern stretching back nearly 12 years, rather than the 2 or 3 years investigators had initially been working with. Renata, building the case alongside attorneys representing Quincy, used Otis's testimony to argue that Simone's behavior wasn't a series of isolated relationship failures, but a long-running, deliberate financial pattern repeated with enough consistency to remove any reasonable doubt about intent. The judge, reviewing 4 separate accounts spanning more than a decade, each describing strikingly similar tactics, ultimately agreed that the pattern itself constituted meaningful evidence, even in the absence of a single criminal conviction tying everything together under one charge. During the trial itself, which stretched across 4 separate hearing days spread out over several months, due to scheduling conflicts and procedural delays, Camille attended only once, on the day Andre was scheduled to testify about the timeline of events following his discovery of the empty apartment. She hadn't planned on attending at all, but something about the finality of the proceedings, the sense that an entire chapter of her own life was being formally closed in a courtroom regardless of her presence, pulled her toward the courthouse that morning. She sat near the back, away from Andre's direct line of sight, and listened as he described, in a steadier voice than she expected, the note on the counter, the empty rooms, the calls that went unanswered. She didn't feel triumphant watching him relive that moment. She felt, mostly, a quiet and unexpected sense of closure, the recognition that whatever had once connected them as husband and wife had been replaced entirely by something more distant and more complete, a chapter fully finished rather than simply abandoned. Andre noticed her sitting near the back of the courtroom only after his testimony had concluded, and the two spoke briefly in the hallway outside, their first real conversation in nearly 3 years that didn't involve financial documents or legal logistics. He thanked her again for the folder of records she had provided, acknowledging that without her documentation habits, his own case might never have held together well enough to reach a courtroom at all. Camille accepted the thanks simply, without elaborating further, and the two parted ways in the parking lot without any dramatic final exchange. No tearful reconciliation. No bitter parting words. Just two people who had once shared a life, now sharing nothing more than a brief, civil acknowledgement of everything that had happened between them. The local news segment that had eventually led Otis to come forward aired on a Tuesday evening broadcast, covering what the reporter described only as a pattern of financial exploitation affecting multiple victims across the central and coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina. The segment never named Simone directly, citing ongoing civil proceedings, but it described enough specific details: the joint account access, the rapid relocation patterns, the consistent timeline of relationships lasting between 10 and 14 months before a sudden disappearance, that several other people watching that night reportedly recognized pieces of their own experiences, though none beyond Otis ever formally came forward to join the case. Desmond later mentioned, somewhat off the record, that he suspected the actual number of people affected by Simone's pattern over the years was likely higher than the 4 who eventually participated in the legal proceedings, simply because shame and embarrassment tend to keep people silent far longer than anger ever does. Camille's sister, Yolanda, who had been the first person to notice something was wrong in Camille's marriage years earlier, became something of an informal advocate for Camille throughout the entire ordeal, attending every hearing Camille herself chose not to attend, and reporting back details afterward over long phone calls that usually ended with both sisters laughing, despite the heaviness of what they were discussing, a coping mechanism the two of them had relied on since childhood, whenever life handed them something too absurd to simply cry about. It was Yolanda who first suggested that Camille turn her experience into something more structured, encouraging her to formalize the financial consulting work she had been doing informally for friends and acquaintances into an actual registered practice, advice that eventually became the foundation of the business Camille built in the years that followed. The community workshop where Camille eventually shared parts of her story, the same one where Andre agreed to speak anonymously about his experience, became something of an annual event in the years following the case's resolution, drawing increasingly larger crowds each year as word spread through local churches, community centers, and eventually a regional women's networking group that invited Camille to speak at a larger conference 2 years after the workshop's first session. She never used Simone's name publicly, never turned the story into something sensationalized beyond what was necessary to illustrate the practical lessons she wanted to share. She focused instead on concrete habits, reviewing joint accounts regularly regardless of how much trust existed in a relationship, maintaining independent financial documentation even during stable periods, and recognizing the specific warning signs of someone moving too quickly to gain financial access early in a relationship. Signs she now believed were visible far earlier than most people realized, if only someone had taught them what to look for in advance. Quincy attended one of these workshops himself, nearly 3 years after the case concluded, having heard about it through a mutual connection from his work in nonprofit financial oversight. He introduced himself to Camille afterward, the first time the two had ever spoken directly, despite their lives having been connected so closely through Simone and through the legal proceedings that followed. Their conversation was brief, but genuine. Two people who had never met under ordinary circumstances, finding an unusual kind of understanding and having survived parallel versions of the same experience years apart. Quincy later became an occasional guest speaker at the same workshop series, offering a perspective Camille couldn't provide herself. The experience of a man who had been financially exploited in a relationship. A perspective he noted was rarely discussed openly, given how much shame still surrounds men admitting they were manipulated, rather than simply unlucky in love. Andre's relationship with his own business slowly transformed over the years following the case, eventually shifting away from the high-pressure, rapid expansion model he had pursued before the affair, toward a smaller, more sustainable operation that prioritized stability over growth. He credited this shift, when he spoke about it at all, less to the financial losses themselves and more to the broader recognition that the version of success he had been chasing during his relationship with Simone, the validation, the sense of being desired and admired, had blinded him to far more fundamental warning signs that a slower, more grounded version of himself might have caught much earlier. He eventually remarried, several years after the case concluded, to a woman he met through a mutual friend who had no connection to his trucking business or to any of the financial chaos that had defined the previous chapter of his life. And by most accounts, including a brief and entirely coincidental encounter Camille had with him at a community event years later, he seemed genuinely happier, steadier, and considerably more cautious about who he allowed access to the financial foundations of his life. Desmond, in his retirement, occasionally returned to the case in conversation with younger detectives he mentored informally, using it as a teaching example of how financial exploitation cases often hide in plain sight for years, simply because victims feel too embarrassed to compare notes with anyone else who might recognize the pattern. He often pointed out that the case never would have come together at all without a series of small coincidences. A colleague mentioning a contractor's old story, a local news segment vague enough to avoid legal complications but specific enough to jog someone's memory, a detective willing to follow a thin thread rather than dismiss it as unrelated noise. He described it, in his own words during one mentoring session, a younger detective later recounted to a local reporter working on an unrelated story, as proof that patience in investigative work often matters more than instinct, and that the most damaging patterns in people's lives are rarely uncovered through dramatic breakthroughs, but through slow, careful accumulation of small, overlooked details. Otis, for his part, used the modest settlement he eventually received not to recover the original losses from his marriage, which the amount barely covered, but to finally pay off the small personal loan that had been taken out in his name all those years earlier, a debt he had been quietly paying down without fully understanding its origin for over a decade. He described the settlement less as financial relief and more as a strange kind of permission to finally stop blaming himself for financial habits he had spent years assuming were simply his own failures rather than the result of someone else's deliberate actions. He returned to a quiet, private life afterward, declining further interviews or public appearances, content to have simply understood, finally, what had actually happened to him all those years ago. What stayed with almost everyone connected to this story, long after the legal proceedings concluded and the settlements were paid, wasn't any single dramatic moment, not the empty apartment, not the courtroom testimony, not even the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually tied four separate stories into one undeniable pattern. What stayed with them was the quieter realization that betrayal, when it's calculated rather than impulsive, rarely announces itself clearly enough to be caught early. It moves slowly, disguised as affection, as trust, as partnership, until enough time has passed that untangling it requires the kind of patience and documentation most people never think to prepare for when they fall in love. Camille often said, in the years following everything that happened, that the version of herself who first noticed a strange hotel charge on an old bank statement had no idea she was building the foundation not just for her own protection, but eventually for an entire community of strangers who would benefit from the habits she developed, simply trying to understand her own marriage. In the years since, none of the people connected to this story have fully reconnected as a group. Though small, unexpected overlaps continue to occur. Quincy speaking at Camille's workshop. Andre's brief encounter with Camille at a community event. Otis quietly settling an old debt that had haunted him without explanation. for over a decade. Simone herself, as far as anyone involved in this story has been able to determine, has not resurfaced publicly in any capacity since completing her structured settlement payments. And whether the pattern she repeated across more than a decade and at least 4 documented relationships has continued elsewhere, under a different name, in a different state, with someone who has yet to recognize what's happening to them, remains an open question that none of the people in this story can answer with certainty. It is, in many ways, the most unsettling part of an otherwise resolved story. The quiet acknowledgement that some patterns, once interrupted in one place, simply continue somewhere else entirely, invisible until someone, somewhere, finally notices the same warning signs early enough to ask the right questions before it's too late. There is one more thread to this story worth telling in full, because it explains something none of the men involved ever fully understood about Simone, until years after everything else had already settled. It involves her mother, a woman named Dolores who lived alone in a small house outside Columbia, South Carolina, and who, according to Otis, had been a constant presence during the early years of Simone's adult life, in ways that shaped far more of her behavior than anyone outside the family ever recognized at the time. Dolores had been married 3 times herself, each marriage ending under circumstances that, according to old neighbors Desmond eventually interviewed as part of his broader curiosity about the case, even after his official involvement had ended, followed a strikingly similar pattern to what Simone would later repeat with the men in her own life. Joint accounts opened quickly, sudden relocations following financial disputes, a pattern so consistent across 2 generations that it raised uncomfortable questions about how much of Simone's behavior had been learned rather than simply chosen. Desmond, by this point retired, and pursuing the thread mostly out of personal curiosity rather than any official capacity, never published his findings or shared them beyond a few private conversations with people directly involved in the case. He mentioned once, during a long phone call with Camille after she reached out to thank him for his original work on the case, that understanding Dolores's history didn't excuse anything Simone had done, but it did help explain how a pattern this specific and this consistent could have developed in the first place. Children raised around that kind of financial instability, he suggested, sometimes absorb it as a survival strategy long before they understand it as something harmful, normalizing behavior that looks, from a distance, calculated and cold, but which started, perhaps, as a defense mechanism inherited from watching a parent navigate the world the same way for years. Camille found herself thinking about this detail more than almost anything else that emerged during the entire ordeal, not because it changed how she felt about what had happened to her own marriage, but because it complicated the simple narrative she might otherwise have settled into. The idea of Simone as a straightforward villain moving through the world with nothing but calculation guiding her choices. It didn't soften the consequences Simone deserved to face, and it didn't make Camille feel sympathy exactly, but it added a layer of context that made the entire story feel less like a simple morality tale and more like a genuine, complicated reflection of how patterns move quietly through families and generations, until someone, somewhere, either breaks the cycle or continues it without fully realizing what they're repeating. This context became part of what Camille eventually incorporated into her workshop sessions years later, not as an excuse offered on Simone's behalf, but as a broader lesson about recognizing patterns early, both in partners and in oneself. She began encouraging the people who attended her sessions to consider not just the financial habits of a new partner, but the broader patterns visible in how that partner's family had handled money, trust, and conflict over the years. Patterns that often predicted future behavior far more reliably than anything a person said about themselves directly. It was, she often noted, a far less comfortable thing to investigate than a simple credit score or employment history. But in her experience, It told a more complete story than almost anything else available to someone trying to understand who they were really building a life with. Years later, long after the case itself had faded from any local relevance beyond the small circle of people directly involved, Camille received an unexpected message through her consulting practice's website from a woman in Ohio who explained, somewhat hesitantly, that she had stumbled across an old, anonymized version of Camille's story shared in a financial literacy newsletter, and that something about the details, the joint accounts, the sudden relocation, the vehicle transferred without her partner's knowledge, felt unsettlingly familiar to her own situation. Camille spent nearly 2 hours on the phone with this woman, walking her through the same documentation strategies she had developed years earlier during her own marriage. Strategies that had since become almost second nature to teach, but had once felt like nothing more than a desperate, improvised response to a situation she barely understood at the time. That woman in Ohio, whose name Camille never shared publicly out of respect for her privacy, eventually built her own case against a partner whose behavior matched a pattern disturbingly similar to Simone's, though the two situations were entirely unconnected, beyond the coincidence of shared tactics that, as Camille had come to understand by then, were simply common among people who approached relationships with calculated financial intent rather than genuine partnership. The woman's case resolved more quickly than Camille's own situation had, partly because she had Camille's guidance from the very beginning, rather than discovering these strategies independently over months of trial and error. It was, in its own quiet way, the clearest evidence Camille ever received that her experience, painful as it had been to live through, had ultimately become something useful, far beyond the boundaries of her own life, a kind of unintended legacy built from documentation, patience, and the simple willingness to pay attention when something didn't add up. Andre, in one of his rare public reflections on the entire situation, offered during the same community workshop where he had once spoken anonymously, said something that stuck with several attendees long after the session ended. He said that the hardest part of everything he experienced wasn't the financial loss itself, significant as it had been, but the slower process of rebuilding trust in his own judgment. The quiet, persistent doubt that crept in afterward, every time he considered a new relationship or a new business decision, wondering whether he was missing something obvious again, simply because he had missed it so completely once before. He said it took years, longer than he expected, to separate the specific lesson of his situation, recognize manipulation, document financial decisions, slow down before granting access, from a broader and less useful lesson his mind kept trying to absorb instead, the false idea that he simply couldn't trust his own instincts anymore at all. Quincy offered a similar reflection during his own guest appearances at Camille's workshop, noting that the most difficult part of his recovery wasn't rebuilding his finances, which had taken time but had ultimately been manageable, but rebuilding his sense of identity as someone who prided himself on being careful, analytical, and difficult to deceive. Being deceived so thoroughly by someone he had genuinely loved forced him to reconsider assumptions he had held about himself for most of his adult life. Assumptions about his own perceptiveness and judgment that had quietly shaped how he saw himself long before Simone ever entered his life. He said more than once that the experience had ultimately made him more compassionate toward other people navigating similar situations, precisely because he understood now how easily intelligence and carefulness could still be outmaneuvered by someone skilled enough at exploiting trust, rather than simply attacking it directly. The story, by the time it reached its quietest and most settled form years later, had become something larger than the sum of its original parts. No longer simply the account of one husband's affair and one wife's quiet, methodical response to betrayal, but a broader case study in how financial exploitation moves through relationships, families, and even generations when left unexamined. It became through Camille's workshops, through Quincy's guest appearances, through the anonymous newsletter that eventually reached a woman in Ohio who needed exactly the guidance Camille had to offer, something closer to a living resource than a closed chapter, continuing to help people long after the original participants in the story had each, in their own separate ways, moved on to build lives defined far more by stability and self-awareness than by the chaos that had once connected them all to the same woman and the same pattern of careful, calculated betrayal. And perhaps that, more than any single twist or revelation along the way, is the real ending this story has to offer. Not a single dramatic moment of justice, not a courtroom verdict large enough to undo what was taken, not even a clear, satisfying account of where Simone ultimately ended up, or whether she ever stopped repeating the pattern that had defined so much of her adult life. The real ending is simply this: a group of people who never expected to be connected to each other at all, brought together by the same quiet, patient woman's careful documentation, eventually building something more lasting and more useful than anything that was ever taken from them in the first place. Sometimes the most meaningful resolution to a story about betrayal isn't found in punishing the person responsible, but in what the people left behind choose to build afterward, brick by brick, document by document, conversation by conversation, until the damage that once felt unbearable becomes, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the foundation for something far steadier than what came before it. It's worth pausing here, near the end, to revisit the very beginning of this story with fresh eyes, because the details that felt simple in the opening moments carry far more weight once you understand everything that followed. The wedding ring sliding off a finger and landing on a hotel nightstand wasn't just a symbolic image meant to grab attention in the opening seconds. It represented a specific night, one of dozens, when Andre made a choice that felt small and contained in the moment, but that quietly set off a chain of consequences, reaching far beyond his own marriage, touching the lives of a contractor in Augusta, a car wash owner in Columbia, a warehouse manager in Savannah, and a delivery fleet supervisor in Macon, none of whom had any idea their lives would eventually be connected by the same woman's carefully repeated pattern. A single decision, made in a single hotel room, rippled outward for more than a decade before anyone fully understood the shape of what it had set in motion. Camille often returned to this idea in the years following everything that happened, the way a single moment of betrayal rarely stays contained to the two people directly involved in it. She thought about the contractor in Augusta, who carried his own version of this story silently for years before a chance conversation with a colleague connected his experience to a larger pattern. She thought about Otis, quietly paying down a debt he didn't fully understand the origin of for over a decade, absorbing the consequences of someone else's deliberate choices as though they were simply his own personal failures. She thought about how much shame operates as its own kind of protection for people like Simone, allowing patterns like hers to continue simply because the people affected by them would rather move on quietly than risk the discomfort of speaking openly about what happened to them. This, more than anything else, became the central message Camille tried to communicate during her later workshop sessions. The idea that silence, however understandable and however protective it might feel in the moment, often becomes the very thing that allows harmful patterns to continue uninterrupted. She never criticized the men who had stayed quiet for years before eventually coming forward, fully understanding the embarrassment and self-doubt that kept them silent for as long as it did. But she did emphasize, consistently, that the case against Simone only came together at all because a handful of people eventually chose to speak, however reluctantly, about experiences they had spent years trying to forget entirely. Patterns like the one Simone repeated for over a decade rely heavily on isolation, on each individual victim believing their experience was unique to them, a personal failure rather than evidence of something larger and more deliberate happening around them. Quincy, reflecting on this same idea during one of his later conversations with Camille, pointed out that the modern world, with its scattered records, easy relocation, and general reluctance to discuss financial humiliation openly, makes patterns like Simone's easier to sustain than most people realize. He noted that in an earlier generation, in smaller, more tightly connected communities, a pattern of behavior repeated across multiple relationships might have become local knowledge far more quickly, the kind of thing neighbors and family members would have noticed and discussed long before it stretched across 4 separate states and more than a decade. The very mobility and privacy that modern life offers, while valuable in countless other ways, had also given Simone exactly the kind of cover she needed to start over repeatedly, without ever facing the kind of community accountability that might have interrupted the pattern much earlier. Andre, for his part, eventually came to view his own experience through a slightly different lens as the years passed, focusing less on what had been taken from him and more on what the entire ordeal had ultimately taught him about partnership itself. He remarried, as mentioned earlier, to a woman who approached their shared finances with a transparency he had never fully appreciated during his marriage to Camille, or his relationship with Simone. Regular conversations about spending, shared visibility into every account, a kind of openness that would have felt unnecessary or even excessive to him years earlier, but that he now recognized as one of the clearest markers of a relationship built on genuine partnership rather than convenience or charm. He often said, when he spoke about it at all, that he wished he had understood the value of that kind of transparency far earlier in his life, long before it cost him nearly everything to learn the lesson the hard way. The story, as it exists now, told and retold across community workshops, anonymous newsletters, and the occasional conversation between people who never expected to know each other at all, continues to serve a purpose none of its original participants could have predicted when it all began with a simple hotel charge on an unfamiliar bank statement. It became, in its final form, less a story about a single betrayal and more a detailed map of how financial exploitation moves quietly through relationships when left unchecked, how shame keeps people silent long after they should have spoken up, and how documentation, patience, and the willingness to eventually share difficult experiences with others can transform even the most painful chapters of a person's life into something that genuinely protects other people walking into similar situations without yet realizing what's happening to them. Camille asked once during a later interview what she hoped people would take away from hearing the full account of everything that happened, said simply that she hoped it would make people slower to dismiss their own instincts when something felt off, even slightly, even before they had any concrete proof to point to. She said betrayal of this kind rarely announces itself with obvious warning signs visible from a distance. It arrives quietly, disguised carefully enough that even careful, intelligent, perceptive people can miss it entirely, until significant damage has already been done. The only real defense against it, she said, isn't suspicion or distrust of every new relationship, but simply the steady, unglamorous habit of paying attention, documenting what matters, and trusting that quiet discomfort enough to investigate it before too much time has passed to undo whatever has already begun. And so the story closes not with a single dramatic ending, but with a quiet, ongoing ripple. 4 men who never expected to be connected by the same woman's choices. A woman in Ohio who found guidance from a stranger's anonymized experience exactly when she needed it most. A detective who carried the case with him into retirement simply because it taught him something about patience he never forgot. And a woman named Camille who turned the worst betrayal of her life into something steady, useful, and entirely her own. Proof, in the end, that the person who appears to lose the most at the beginning of a story like this one is sometimes the only person still standing, stronger and more clear-eyed than ever, once everyone else has had to live with the consequences of choices they can never fully take back. If this story had you holding your breath the way it had us writing it, let us know in the comments which part shocked you the most, and don't forget to follow or subscribe so you never miss the next real-life story we bring you.